Good evening and welcome. Please note that our program will begin in just a minute or two. Good evening and welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, president of the Boston Public Library and host for this series on the Arc of History, Contested Perspectives, coming to you live from the Bates Hall Reading Room here at the Central Library in Copley Square. This is a space that many have used for reading, research, education, and the pursuit of knowledge, and will do so again in person once it's safe to do so. Tonight's program is also part of the library's Author Talk series, and will be recorded. We are streaming to YouTube tonight and will be made available on our website following the program. Our book sponsor tonight is Trident Bookstores, and for this work by our guest or other books by him, please check out your local independent bookstore, such as Trident Booksellers and Cafe, or of course, check out your local library. Our series picks up figures, issues, and topics from history and maps them onto current reality. Tonight, we will explore the life of President Jimmy Carter, going beyond the popular conception of him and his presidency, as well as ask ourselves what we can learn about successful presidents, successful presidencies, and successful presidential leadership. And I'm joined tonight by the author, Jonathan Alter. He is a well-known author, a historian, a political commentary, and has won three, I think been on the New York Times booksellers list, top lists at least 3 times with books on Obama and on FDR. He also collaborated on one of the most popular documentaries on HBO, which we'll maybe hear a little bit about as well tonight. Jonathan, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us and for sharing what is an amazing tome on Jimmy Carter. Would you just set up for us how you got interested in this topic and why this book, why now?
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Boston Public Library and everybody who tuned in tonight. I think I would just start by taking a polite issue with that word tome. Because I got a little bit upset when I saw that the book was listed for sale as 800 pages when it's actually only 670 pages. The rest is notes. And the reason I'm a little sensitive on this is that I worked really hard to make it a good story and a readable story. And fortunately, the critics in the New York Times and elsewhere have all agreed that it is readable. So I'm trying to avoid the tome label. And there's
as an academic, tome is a good word in my in my background, but I agree, it's very readable, and I think you've captured so much about the man that we might not otherwise have known.
And I tried to put in things, sort of fun things as I went along. Just to give you, one example. Everybody knows that Jimmy Carter had this brother named Billy, who was a good old boy. And at one point, he was so popular that they had Billy Beer that for a brief moment, had its popularity. But Billy himself didn't like the beer, and he poured it in the toilet and would fill it up with vodka. And he was, asked about his brother during the campaign in 1976. And he said, I've got a mother who went into the Peace Corps at age 68. That's Lillian Carter, Jimmy's mother. He said, I got one sister who's a holy roller. That's Ruth Carter, who was a well-known evangelist in the 1970s. He said, I got another sister who rides with the Hells Angels. That was Gloria Carter, who on her tombstone reads, she rides in Harley heaven now. And the Hells Angels guarded her hospital room when she was sick. And Billy finished by saying, and I have a brother who thinks he's going to be president of the United States. I'm the only normal one in the family. And so, and speaking of Gloria, his sister, she was so eccentric that she had a tattoo of Tweety Bird driving a lawnmower on her back. So I just mentioned that not because any of that is central to, a pretty serious revisionist take on Jimmy Carter, but because I did work hard to keep the story going. So what is that story? I see it as an American epic and almost a novel in terms of the things that happened to Jimmy Carter over the course of 96 years and counting. He is a little bit fragile, but alive and very coherent and mentally all there, and living in Plains, Georgia, where he was born. So I argue that Carter essentially lived in 3 centuries. The only American president, maybe only figure of any kind who could claim that. He was born in 1924, but it might as well have been in the 19th century. He had no running water, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment. His family farm, he was well-to-do by local standards. His father's farm was really just one step up from slavery, with sharecroppers, tenant farmers. The reality of the Jim Crow South was almost beyond belief when I started to get into what can only be described as the white terrorism that existed in Southwest Georgia from the 20s right through the late 1960s. And then, of course, he was part of many of the great social movements of the 20th century, especially the women's movement. He not only wrote a book recently about the abuse of women around the world, which he considers to be the number one problem in the world after income inequality and climate change. And he transformed the federal government, and he appointed, for instance, 5 times as many women to the federal bench as all of his predecessors combined, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who he put on the court, although it was Clinton who elevated her to the Supreme Court. But when she was asked, when did you know you wanted to be a judge? She said, I didn't think it was possible for me to be a judge until Jimmy Carter decided that half the human race had something to offer. So he was involved in, all of the events of the 20th century, the Naval Academy during World War II, president during the Cold War. He was not involved in the civil rights movement, which I'll get to in a little while. And then in terms of the 21st century, the Carter Center is on the cutting edge of global health, democracy, promotion, peacekeeping, many of the important issues of the 21st century, which until just last year, Jimmy Carter was holding, 6 hours of meetings a day, traveling all over the world, pursuing the interests of the Carter Center. But what I wanted to do in this book was to go at what I saw as the faulty conventional wisdom about Carter, which is essentially inept president, great former president. And that's not only an oversimplification, it's just wrong. And I looked at Carter as a underrated American president, a political failure, but a substantive and often far-sighted success. And I think his post-presidency, while very inspirational, is a little bit overrated because he didn't have the levers of power that he had when he was president. And while he's done a great job in nearly eradicating guinea worm disease, great progress against river blindness and other diseases, and particularly in 1994, he did a very important peacekeeping in North Korea and Haiti. Those achievements and others, working on Habitat for humanity projects for a week every year, these are wonderful, but they're subordinate to his many achievements as president. 14 major pieces of environmental legislation, establishing a human rights policy that, while hypocritical in certain respects that we can get into, was for the first time set a global standard on how governments should treat their own people. Opened full diplomatic relations with Deng Xiaoping's China, and together they established what we now view as the global economy. At the time, China had a GDP of that of sub-Saharan African country, and now that relationship, that bilateral relationship, for all of its problems, is the foundation. The Camp David Accords made Jimmy Carter, although he's viewed rightly as pro-Palestinian, it made him the greatest president for the security of the state of Israel since Harry Truman, by taking the Egyptian army off the table. That was the only army that could destroy Israel. The Panama Canal treaties, which seem like kind of a dusty, old thing, turning over control of the canal to Panama, which was extremely difficult to do and cost 5 Democratic senators their seats. Very unpopular. Ronald Reagan made his career on that issue. It prevented a open-ended war in Central America, and we would have, by the estimates of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, we would have had 100,000 troops minimal in Panama forever, defending the canal, which of course is central to global trade. There's a lot there on the domestic side that I haven't talked to. There's a lot there about his personal life. I have these very steamy love letters that he wrote to Rosalynn when he was in the Navy, which are the steamiest ever between a president and a first lady. I know you guys come from John and Abigail Adams territory. Let me tell you, their correspondence is very tame compared to that of Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter. So I guess with that, I'll shut up, and I'm eager to hear any of your questions.
Yeah, thanks for that amazing introduction. It seems like we're now on a journey of rediscovering the strengths of Jimmy Carter's life and presidency, and I've learned so much already from the parts of the book that I've had time to really read. But let's meet the main topic that you're addressing head on. Where did this image of Jimmy Carter as a not that accomplished president and great after president or former president, where did that come from? How did that get formed?
Well, I think his problems started pretty early in his presidency. He was a true outsider his whole life. He was always an outsider. He was actually raised in a town smaller than Plains. Plains has 600 people. He was raised in archery on a farm just outside of Plains, 45 people. And he would go to school in Plains, and he was an outsider even then. So you can imagine, the journey that he took from archery, Georgia, to being this global icon, citizen of the world, Nobel Peace Prize winner. So he's constantly coming in from the outside. And when he got to the presidency, even though he was at as high as 70% his first year in office, he didn't organize his White House in a smart way. He didn't have a chief of staff. The post-Watergate press, which had helped bring him to the presidency, because, he ran this campaign very similar to Joe Biden's, actually used some of the same language about healing, and Biden was his first supporter in the Senate. He ran this campaign that had a moral appeal to it, a moral ideology, and that was the perfect tone to strike after Vietnam and Watergate, in the same way that Biden was perfectly positioned with this decency and soul of America campaign, after, against Trump. So but the problem is, when he got there, the Washington press corps, and this could be a problem for Biden, they were so used to doing scandal reporting, they just assumed that he was not on the level and that he must be a liar like all the rest of them. And so as his press secretary, Jody Powell, said, we not only didn't get a honeymoon, we didn't get a one-night stand after he became president. And it's true, like on his first day in office, he pardoned all draft dodgers. And, this was a really important thing to do to bring some closure after the Vietnam War, but he just got hammered for it by the right. And there were a series of other things that happened that we can talk about that lessened his popularity in his first 2 years, but he still probably would have been reelected if he hadn't been swamped by external events in the second 2 years of his presidency, where, the economy fell apart. The Iranians seized American hostages in Tehran. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And so by the time he's running for reelection, he's really facing gale force winds. And when Ronald Reagan, who was a better communicator and sort of thoroughbred candidate, when he beats him badly in a landslide, then Carter has, the scarlet L, loser, on his chest. I'm hoping that will now apply to Donald Trump, although Trump didn't lose by as much as Carter did. Nonetheless, it's very rare for an incumbent to lose. It's just, of elected incumbents in the last 100 years, it's just Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, George Herbert Walker Bush, and now Donald Trump. So Trump is in very elite company. And so that hurt him. That hurt his reputation. And unlike Trump, Carter didn't have this hardcore base of Carterites, who loved him. Black voters were very loyal to him, but the intensity of the loyalty to Carter after he left office, it just went away. Then in terms of why his post-presidency was so popular, he revolutionized it. He became, with the possible exception of John Quincy Adams, who, did so much to fight slavery after he left office and served in the House of Representatives, Carter is the greatest former president in American history, not just the longest lived, but he's done the most for the world after leaving office. And that changed the standard for all post-presidents, for all former presidents.
Yeah, I do want to come back to his early formative years, but because we're talking a little bit about the presidency in the 70s and what comes immediately afterwards, there are two quotes. One of them I can't find again, so maybe it'll resonate with you. There's one quote in here that characterizes the 1970s as a kidney stone of a decade.
Yeah.
Which I thought was an absolutely fabulous phrase to describe the headwinds that might have been in place in the context.
Right. So that quote is from Doonesbury, which is the fantastic cartoon strip that is written by my close friend Gary Trudeau. And Gary, who we went together to the New Hampshire primary this year, as we have every 4 years since 1992, and then we collaborated on a television show that was on Amazon called Alpha House, starring John Goodman, and we had 2 seasons. You can watch that. It's about 4 senators who live in a man cave on Capitol Hill. So that was Gary's line from Doonesbury in the 1970s, and I thought it really summed up what was painful about that decade. So Carter was both governor and president in the 1970s, and a pretty good chunk of my book is about that very sour decade. And Carter delivered a fascinating speech called the Malaise Speech about the crisis of confidence in the United States in 1979. He actually never used the word malaise in the speech, but he was describing a malaise at large in the United States. And he was confessing in ways that are unimaginable now about his own shortcomings. And he confessed in that speech, and he tried to put us on a new energy path. Now, a lot of what he proposed in that speech didn't happen, but he was enormously farsighted on energy. And my book starts with him putting solar panels on the roof of the White House just a few weeks before he gave that malaise speech. And people yawned. The press didn't care when he would do things like introduce fuel economy standards for automobiles for the first time, or toxic waste cleanup, or the first green energy supported by the federal government, the first rules allowing public utilities to use renewable green energy. These things were yawned at by the press. So there was an awful lot that happened that was of really enduring importance. At the end of his time in office, he was proposing climate change initiatives that are exactly the same as the Paris Climate Agreement 35 years later. And if he'd been reelected, we would have been addressing climate change in the early 1980s, which lends a kind of a tragic dimension to his defeat that year.
Yeah, there are clearly groundbreaking and visionary, yet somewhat boring regulations and laws that get put into place that got overshadowed by what was to come.
Because they're boring, they each get like a half a paragraph, like 2 sentences. Because I want to give Carter credit for these things.
Yeah.
Some things like the Panama Canal Treaties, which is a super dramatic story.
Right.
They have a whole chapter. But
right.
if it was like a piece of energy regulation, it's just got a couple of sentences, because I want it put on his record and his ledger, but I don't want to make it boring.
One more on this topic, and then we will go back to his early life to get us started. And this is the comparison with Clinton that you make, where Carter was willing to swing for something ambitious, and in some cases throws caution to the wind because he has the vision of what it's about. And I think the point about Clinton is that he was much more cautious, but often more effective. Is that something that you could expand on a little bit?
So Bill Clinton, who is an important character in this book because he had this terribly fraught relationship with Jimmy Carter, with both when he was governor. He thought Carter's decision to allow Cuban refugees to go to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, cost him his governorship. And then when Clinton was president, they quarreled in very dramatic ways. But I describe Bill Clinton as publicly cautious and privately reckless. And Jimmy Carter was publicly, if not reckless, a real risk taker. And of course, privately, not reckless at all. And he had, one of the world's great marriages, although they, like any marriage, they had their own, issues from time to time, which I describe. But Carter would always write on the margin, and I found at the Carter Library in Atlanta, often on the margins of memos from staff, be bold. He wanted them to aim high. The only area where he didn't do that was a big one, and that was on healthcare. And so he had this titanic struggle with Ted Kennedy over this, which eventually led to Kennedy challenging him for the nomination in 1980. And that weakened Carter. I don't think it cost him the presidency, but it sure didn't help. And it was a contributing factor in his defeat that he did not have a unified Democratic Party. And if Trump, for instance, had not had a unified Republican Party, he would have been crushed in a landslide. But despite the Lincoln Project and some other things, Trump mostly has had a unified Republican Party, and he wasn't challenged in the primaries. So that Kennedy struggle was, a lot of it was that Carter wasn't as ambitious as Kennedy on healthcare. Kennedy, interestingly, did not want Medicare for all, or what they then called single payer. He realized that was not politically possible, but he had a more ambitious plan. Carter's plan was late and it was more like what became Obamacare 35 years later. But the fact that these two men were like oil and water, which I deal with a lot, they met through Hunter Thompson of all people. And Hunter Thompson became a big Jimmy Carter fan in 1974 when Jimmy Carter gave this speech as governor of Georgia, attacking the criminal justice system in Georgia. And at that time, Carter was cool. That's why I have the Andy Warhol of him on my cover. And we think of him as being this kind of pious guy in a cardigan sweater, and he's so much more complicated than that. But that struggle with Kennedy, it was tragic also because they couldn't come to agreement. There was enough blame to go around, and the net effect was that we had to wait 35 years before people with pre-existing conditions, for instance, didn't get thrown to the wolves.
It's fascinating that you've now mentioned who would be three archetypes of democratic political values: Ted Kennedy, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter. Yet is there a narrative whereby they would have a shared vision or shared values, or is the tent really so big that they actually had more differences than shared?
Oh no, they had much more in common. And Kennedy voted for almost everything that Carter proposed, and they worked closely together on trucking and airline deregulation. And Steve Breyer, who was Carter's appointment to the bench, he had been Kennedy's staffer and on these deregulation issues. Remember, now deregulation has kind of a dirty connotation among liberals, but economic deregulation, when it not applied to Wall Street, but to the trucking and airline industry, led to much lower fares eventually.
Right. Competition.
And also in trucking, to the just-in-time delivery system that we now have in this country that, revolution made, everything really possible in terms of today's economy. And so that was Steve Breyer. And then Carter, at the end of his time in office, and this gives you an idea of how different things are, he appointed Breyer to the federal bench. Clinton later elevated him to the Supreme Court. But it was after he lost that he appointed him. And the conservatives, like Strom Thurmond, these racist conservatives, they could have held up the nomination until Reagan took over, so they could get a conservative on the bench. And they knew Breyer from his work on Kennedy's staff, and so they let Carter's nomination go through. On your larger question, while Kennedy was more progressive than Carter on certain issues, not all issues. Carter was super progressive on race and on environmental issues, but Carter was a budget balancer, and Kennedy felt like he should be giving social programs more money, which actually doesn't stand up that well under historical scrutiny, because Carter was dramatically expanding food stamps, and he just wasn't giving enough money by Kennedy's definition and by the liberal standards of the day, which today, would seem almost outlandish. That's how much the pendulum has swung. As far as Bill Clinton and Barack Obama go, Carter anticipated them with this kind of moderate liberalism, and much of what it meant to be a new Democrat, as Clinton called it, that started under Jimmy Carter. But unlike Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter's slight deregulation of Wall Street wasn't nearly as, in fact, it wasn't really harmful at all to people, whereas Clinton's is now being second guessed. And so Carter was a neoliberal before neoliberal was a dirty word. It just meant that you agreed with the goals of liberalism, but were very open to new ways from any place. They could be from the conservative side or the liberal side as a means of achieving those goals. So my favorite example of that is on welfare reform. And just without getting too into the weeds on this. So in the 70s, If you were liberal, you wanted to expand welfare, whether you were working or not, so that, if you were a single male and out of a job, you should get more money rather than any. And Republicans wanted work requirements that were punitive. So Carter was somewhere in the middle, and he couldn't get welfare reform through. It was one of the areas that he failed. But what he did come up with was this idea of making work pay, so that if you did get a job, you could be pulled out of the working poor into the middle class. Mm. And the mechanism for that is something called the earned income tax credit, which is one of those things, by the time you get to tax credit, you're bored, right? I'm asleep. Earned income tax credit. Well, it happens to be the most successful anti-poverty program since Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps in the mid 1960s. And Obama expanded it. Clinton and Obama both expanded it by a lot. And so now you have millions of Americans who are, maybe they're making $22,000 a year, and they get a check from the government for $6,000. It's really a significant amount of money for helping boost them into the middle class. And this is the kind of moderate policy making that Jimmy Carter specialized in.
I could stay on this topic all night, but we better talk about the man himself and his early formative years. And so what I would like to do is look at his roots growing up first, and maybe give us a couple of highlights or stories about that time period. It strikes me from having read the early chapters, and we obviously want everybody to read the book to hear more, but the sheer poverty, the hard work, the Christian values, his family, all seem to play a really strong role in early formation.
Yeah. So Jimmy Carter was the product of I guess it's fair to say that he was raised in many respects by an illiterate Black woman named Rachel Clark, who was a cotton picker on his father's farm. His father, Earl Carter, was a disciplinarian, white supremacist. He tried to be a nice white supremacist, which is a contradiction in terms, but he said that he should be judged by how he treated his N-word. His mother, Lillian Carter, took care of Black patients for free. She was a nurse. She brought Jimmy to Black churches. She wasn't an integrationist as we think of now, although later in life she became very liberal. But at the time, they were in this Jim Crow society. And, so when Jimmy was young, she didn't believe in intermarriage, for instance, or anything like that. But she was liberal and said nice things about Abraham Lincoln. So he's getting that influence. Also, the nursing contributed to his interest in global health later on. But it was really Rachel who introduced him to spirituality and to nature. And as I mentioned, he, both as governor and president, he did so much on the environment. We could talk all day. He doubled the size of the national park system and protected 105 million acres in Alaska, as well as many other national parks. But so he got that love of nature when he was a kid. And he never became a racist himself. His playmates were Black. And when he got to the Naval Academy, to the shock and horror of the other Southerners who were there, he protected the first Black midshipman, a guy named Wesley Brown, from hazing. And then when he was in submarines, if there was a party that the Governor General of the Bahamas gave, and he invited only the white crew members of the submarine. And Carter said, "I'm not going if the Blacks on this submarine don't go too." And so none of them went. So that's the way he was, all along. But then what happens, David, is he goes home in 1953. This is after a really eventful period in Admiral Hyman Rickover's nuclear navy, where he's engaged in the most exciting tech project of the middle part of the 20th century, basically attaching a nuclear power plant to the back of a submarine. and they weren't even on land yet. And when an experimental reactor in Canada melted down, Carter was dispatched there, and he had to run into the melted down reactor, and he was only allowed to spend 90 seconds inside. And it was they thought that they might die, doing this, because so little was known about. They actually ended up getting 1,000 times more rads than they anticipated, but he obviously survived. So then he leaves the nuclear navy because his father has died, and he returns home and he takes over his father's farm, his father's peanut warehouse. And he, in order to stay in business and to go into politics, he has to duck the civil rights movement. And after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and Carter's on the school board, eventually becomes chairman of the school board, does he implement that decision? No. Why? Because Georgia enacted a state law saying if you integrate any school in the state of Georgia, it automatically closes. So there was what they called massive resistance, the Brown versus Board of Education desegregation decision, and then white terrorism, where the Klan would come through town. So Carter is ducking, trying every so often he'd pop up and try to do something a little bit brave, like try to allow blacks into his church as visitors. They had gone to his father's funeral. So at the height of the civil rights movement, he thought it was wrong that they passed a resolution in the church to not allow any blacks to even cross the threshold of the church. And that stayed in existence until after Carter was president. That's how enduring these segregationist ideas were. So I just got fascinated by how he dealt with these conditions. And Martin Luther King called the sheriff the meanest man in the world. Carter's sheriff made Bull Connor look like a nice guy. So those years, and what Carter did to make up for it after he became governor of Georgia, a minute after he becomes governor of Georgia, he says the time for racial discrimination is over. And everybody is shocked that he has done this, especially the good old boys who had put him in office. They felt he had betrayed them because he'd run a kind of a dog whistle campaign to get elected governor, not explicitly racist, but appealing to racists. And then his turnaround then is just so instructive. And he basically spent the second half of his life atoning for what he didn't do in the first half.
I mean, this is a fascinating through line to read the book from, because the personal values seem pretty well formed and pretty moderate and pretty balanced, and they continue to be exhibited in the person that he was. And yet the opportunities for political leadership, you can either say he didn't do enough at this particular point in time, or you can take a more realpolitik version and say it wasn't possible to do it at the time. But then, as you say, if you look at the arc as a whole, I won't ask you to grade the arc as a whole because I don't think that's fair. But it tells a different story than any individual incident.
Right. So it depended what office he held. So when he was in the Georgia State Senate, he was representing one of the most conservative districts in the state of Georgia. And so he did a lot of things. He got a lot of bills through, but he couldn't really stand up on civil rights. When he did, in one speech, which he later liked to brag about, he made sure that the local press didn't know anything about it. So it was a little bit like going to confession. He was able to say to himself, well, I gave that speech, where I came out against the 30 questions, which was one way that they disenfranchised black would-be voters by asking them a series of completely unanswerable questions. How many jelly beans are in this jar? Or, like who is the former recorder of deeds in Webster County, and
Crazy.
and so he spoke out against that, but he didn't go any further than that, and he didn't stand up. And then when he was running for governor, and this is after a born again experience, after he's gone door to door as a missionary at one point in 1968, came upon a brothel, tried to convert the madam. That's a whole other story. But, so he's running for governor a second time, and he faces a choice. The only way for him to win is to win the rural areas, because the very popular former governor he's running against had Atlanta and the moderate or liberal areas sewed up. So he had to appeal to the crackers, and he did some things. This was the low point of his whole career. And, but he basically, when I questioned him about it pretty closely, and I interviewed him a dozen times. At one point he said, "Are we done talking about this yet?" He said softly, and I said, "No, President Carter. He prefers to be called President Carter than Mr. President, which he thinks should be reserved for the current occupant, whoever that is." I said, "No, we're not quite done talking about this." And, I needed to get into a conversation with him about this.
Yeah.
And he finally said, "Look, I could either have been part of the civil rights movement and denounced racists, or I could have been in politics. And there was a lot that I wanted to achieve. And so I made that choice." And he thinks it was the right choice. And I guess in retrospect, I do too, because once he became governor, then he integrated Georgia state government. And when he became president, he took the federal government from tokenism to true diversity. So, these are all judgments that politicians have to make. But I still think he does, and he did eventually cop to the fact that he was late. 1971 is really late if you look at it, in the broader scheme of things. So after George Floyd, Carter issued a statement. And one of the things he said was, in our travels around the world, because Rosalynn has been his full partner in everything that he has done, which we haven't talked about much yet, but she's a fascinating and hugely formidable figure. So he said, after our many travels around the world, we've learned that silence equals violence, which is what we have been saying. So I think his lesson in having been silent about segregation for so long, and then spending the rest of his life making up for it, we all can take a lesson. We've all, or most of us, have been too silent, especially white Americans, about police brutality. And so now it's on us to act more like Jimmy Carter. We can't all be Jimmy Carter. We can't all become, global humanitarians. But I think we can take that lesson from his life, that you can make up for lost time if you've been silent too long.
His career outside of politics, from the early days, farmer, nuclear engineer, Navy officer, there's quite a breadth of experiences that indicate an incredibly intelligent person, an incredibly pragmatic person. Is that experience and skills and knowledge something he brings into politics later on?
In many respects, yes. So he was only in government for a total of 12 years, 4 in the Georgia State Senate, 4 as governor, and 4 as president. But yes, those qualities become very important, and they also hamper him in certain ways. So I have a chapter called His Inner Engineer. And, the engineering quality generated a lot of criticism of him, because people thought it was, kind of too much in the weeds. And my feeling is, I found him underlining articles in scientific journals about climate change, and before it was called climate change, even before it was called global warming in 1970. So other people are off playing golf. He's reading scientific journals. And then he brought that attention to detail that he was ridiculed for. You wouldn't believe how many people to this day go, "Oh, Carter, yeah, when he was president, too much attention to detail." And one of the big reveals for me was that was not true. That when he did get down into the weeds, it was to get the Camp David Accords, to outsmart the Alaska delegation by knowing as much about, caribou and the headwaters in Alaska as the representatives of that state did. Because of that, he knew the maps, He did this to save rivers when he was governor.
Mhm.
And on a series of other issues. Unfortunately, he did not get into the details enough on the Iranian Revolution, and he got kind of blindsided by that, with very, very serious consequences for his presidency. But most of the time, that engineering quality
Mhm.
served him really well. The problem is that if you look at American business, the engineers usually fall just short of being CEO.
Yeah.
They're lacking, they think if they get to the right answer, the engineering answer, why can't everybody else see it? This is the right answer. Like, be rational. And they don't understand how much of human life and management is irrational, and their EQ, their emotional intelligence, often doesn't match their IQ. And I think this was the case with Carter, where even though he ran a brilliant campaign, he didn't understand that politics and mastering the science of human relationships was as important as it was in Washington. But what's interesting about it, there's so many layers to him, David, that actually he did master the science of human relationships when it came to diplomacy. So he became one of the greatest diplomats of the 20th century. And the Camp David Accords were the most enduring and most important peace treaty since World War II. And this was done not by his representatives, but by him getting and going over each sentence and arguing over each clause with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat.
Yeah.
So this unfortunately has been too long-winded an answer to your question, but I think he's not a guy who wanted to be president from when he was a young age,
Right.
and his able qualities help make him not a great president. I don't argue he belongs on Mount Rushmore, and this is warts and all, and I have all of his shortcomings are in the book, but it made him a very consequential president because a lot more got done than people realize, in part because he had a Democratic Congress for 4 years. Clinton and Obama only had a Democratic Congress for 2 years. So just the volume of legislation, the achievement for the American public that he got through was just much higher. I mean, Donald Trump would never have been impeached if it wasn't for Jimmy Carter, because he introduced and got signed the Ethics in Government Act that protected whistleblowers, Inspector Generals Act that established inspector generals, and there's many, many other examples, creating FEMA under Carter, not just the Department of Energy and the Department of Education, but a series of other important agencies, FISA courts, lots of things that are very relevant to our life today.
There's another brilliant insight that refers, and I think you're heading in that way with those last comments, which is good government is good politics, and that's something that he fundamentally believed in. And later debates become about the size of government rather than the good that government does. So I think that's I'll just leave that out there.
Yeah.
I'm going to pick up one of the questions from the audience at this point, because we were about to go there, and it's really the relationship between Jimmy and Rosalynn, and she was there from so early on. Their marriage together is amazing. Tell us more about the partnership that they had in the work of government and the work of post government.
So, as I mentioned, Jimmy's mother was a nurse, and they lived in a very small town. And when Jimmy was 3 years old, actually, he hadn't yet turned 3, he was still 2. His mother brought him over to the Smith house, where she had just delivered a baby named Rosalynn. And so they met 93 years ago. But they did not start going out until Jimmy was in the Navy. And Rosalynn and Jimmy's sister Ruth were best friends, although Ruth was very upset when they got married. She felt like she was losing her friend to her brother. And then, at first, and Jimmy is very honest about this, he treated her like so many men of that age. He didn't consult with her. So when he decided to leave the Navy, he did it over her objections, and he made the decision rather than making it together. She gave him the silent treatment from Schenectady, where he was based at that time, all the way down to Plains, Georgia. And she'd say to their 6-year-old son, Jack, tell your father we need to stop at a rest stop. She sulked, she told me, for like a year after they moved home, because she was really happy to get out of Plains, even though they've lived there and that's their home in all the years since. Then eventually she became his partner in business, and she taught herself bookkeeping, and she's a very formidable, bright woman. And she introduced a lot of their innovations, their business innovations. So they had a partnership in business and created a successful agribusiness. Then when he's running for governor, she becomes very interested in mental health issues. And both as the First Lady of Georgia and First Lady of the United States, she introduced some of the first significant mental health legislation. And she actually got this bill passed, and shortly before Carter left the presidency, Reagan gutted it, and many of the provisions came back under Obama. But she was a true path breaker on mental health. And she was a diplomat too. She went to South America and acted as a diplomat. She was the first lady to have offices in the East Wing and treat it like a full-time job. She took it way beyond where Eleanor Roosevelt did. And it's really, CNN just did this series on first ladies, and they didn't do all of them, and they didn't do Rosalynn Carter, which was ridiculous, because she literally revolutionized the office of first lady in the same way that Walter Mondale and Carter revolutionized the vice presidency. And the vice president he didn't even have an office in the West Wing before Mondale, and was given nothing to do by Carter's predecessors. So, and then when they left office, Jimmy and Rosalynn together, they always traveled together, did everything together, and they revolutionized the post presidency. And she was also the first person to push caregiving, to kind of define it as its own category. And the Rosalynn Carter Center for Caregiving in Americus, Georgia now is an important institution.
Let's move forward to look on the global stage. This is the arena in which I think you cite that where his greatest achievements possibly are. There are clearly some on domestic policy as well, but there are both incredible successes and ultimately what becomes his undoing, perhaps because of the portrayal in domestic campaigns, but nonetheless. Which of them stand out to you as quintessentially about what Carter was all about? Do you want to talk about Israel and Egypt, the Camp David Accords, Panama Canal? Let's give one, not because it's a historical lecture, but because it gives us an insight into who the man was.
Right.
And
so
is.
What Carter says is that his most long-lasting accomplishment was normalization of relations with China. If you look at how much that changed the world and how possible it was, to bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and how in China, how essential that was. Just to give you one of many examples of how that changed the world, at the time Carter was president, there were about 50 Chinese students who were studying in the United States. Nixon had opened the door, and they had some very preliminary exchanges. And in the middle of the night after normalization, Carter picks up the phone, and it's his science advisor who's sitting there with Deng Xiaoping in Beijing. And Carter thought he was waking him up because of an earthquake or something, and he was a little annoyed to be bothered at 4:00 in the morning. And Frank Press, the science advisor, says Deng Xiaoping wants to know if it's okay to send 1,000 students to the United States. And Carter says, yeah, he can send 10,000 if he wants to, and hangs up the phone as Carter tells the story. There are now 250,000. So this just gives you a sense, studying in the United States, this gives you a sense of the scale that we're talking about, of the change that took place. So that was what Carter says was the most significant. But to answer your question, what was closest to his heart was Camp David and the unfinished business of Camp David. So Camp David was really in two parts. It was peace between Israel and Egypt, and then it was a peace process to lead to autonomy and eventually a Palestinian state and a comprehensive Middle East peace, which was not achieved at Camp David. They put the pieces in place to pursue that process, and for a lot of reasons that we can get into, it didn't go as well as Carter hoped. And so his greatest regret about not having a second term is that he thought he could have had that comprehensive settlement, Middle East settlement, in his second term. And what he calls the Holy Land is so important to him personally because of the religious dimension for him and his faith, that that's what's closest to his heart. But I think he does also feel, even though when he left office, he thought the human rights policy had been what he described as a disappointment because the Cold War was on, there were too many exceptions, the Shah of Iran, Marcos in the Philippines, and he didn't know yet how much good it would do in bringing democracy over the next 10 years to Latin America. And there are now twice as many democracies as there were when Carter was president in the world. And, not just the end of the Cold War, according to Václav Havel and others, but the rebirth of democracy has its origins in that human rights policy. And when he met, there's a Harvard professor named Carl Deutsch, who was down, very distinguished professor of international relations, and he was down visiting Emory, where Carter continues to be associated with Emory, just after Carter left the presidency. And Carter is dejected. He's in a bit of a depression. And he runs into Deutsch, and Deutsch says to him, he doesn't know he's cheering him up, but he says, President Carter, 1,000 years from now, there will be very few American presidents who are remembered. You will be one of them because you set the first global standard for how governments should treat their own people. And Carter, wept when he heard that, because at the time everybody was just, putting the L on him,
And it strikes me that it's even over the course of 50 years, maybe 70 years, the same challenging issues on the global stage are present, even if they are there in perhaps a different way. It's from the Cold War to the current relationship between the U.S. and Russia, the relationship between China and the U.S. More on economic terms than others today, and the global health and global human rights issues, let alone climate change, and yet there are milestone and transformational moments in the Carter short presidency that speak to laying foundations to be better than where we were.
Right. That's why I describe him as a political failure and a farsighted success. And I think there was he was always thinking ahead. It's hard for presidents to do that because the press judges you by politics. Mm-hmm. And you don't get credit for, like when you put the solar panels on the roof, like everybody's yawning. Oh God, photo op. Meanwhile, they're waiting in line for gas, and Carter's down in the 20s because of these long gas lines. And but then he would make decisions like if he had bombed Iran, he probably would have gotten reelected. But he looked weak because he refused to engage in military hostilities. They tried a rescue mission, which disastrously failed, and the details of that are interesting. But then he would not. Even Rosalynn was saying, like, can't you do something? And I argue that he actually probably should have done something, like maybe mine an Iranian harbor or something like that, to show, because Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, held him hostage essentially.
Right.
And held, Ted Koppel's Nightline was first called America Held Hostage. Right. And that made Carter look weak. And when I asked him what was the biggest misconception of you. He said that I was weak, and he's right. He was perceived that way. And that is so at odds with the Jimmy Carter that people know, actually, and that I found was a very tough guy, very difficult, very intense. There's none of this like sweet, genial, the smile is deceptive that way. And, when he drill those icy blues into you, it could be very uncomfortable. And so, like, it's for people who work for him describing it as weak is just bizarre because they describe him as really tough, like a submarine captain who's, he doesn't yell, but like barking out those instructions. And if you are not on it, you got a problem with him. So there these layers to him, David, that kept him interesting for me. I mean, I agree with Stephen Colbert, who says that did a nice interview with me on his show actually about the book, but he says that Trump is fundamentally boring. There's nothing to figure out about him. We know everything. We have his number, and we've had it for a long time. We know who he is, a rotten human being. But in any event, we know who he is. Mm-hmm. Carter, like, nobody really fully understands him, including people in his own family, because the intelligence and the just tremendously varied life experience and his faith and all kinds of other things create this complexity that kept me interested. And then the integrity kept me interested too, because when I had enough of Trump, I could go into the Carter papers, and like you have at your library, and they can have, as when you get into somebody's papers, they can have a restorative effect. They not only transport you to a different time, and then when you discover things, you have the joy of discovery, but I found they had a restorative effect on me, and the papers kind of brushed away the toxins of Trump, and I'm hoping that readers, and some have, like, that's what, say, Walter Isaacson, said about my book, is that Carter's story is inspiring in a dark time, and it tells you, it gives you some sense of maybe what Biden can do, that when we get back to integrity and accountability in a president.
There's another question I want to take up from the audience, which is also one of mine, and it feels essential to understanding who Jimmy Carter is. It's his relationship with religion and spirituality and Christianity, and in no other country, in no other democracy in the world, do I know where we have this relationship between the religious practice and spirituality of our presidents and the practice of politics. I think it shows up in a very empathetic way in Jimmy Carter. So it clearly has his roots in where he grew up, but it becomes and stays part of his life throughout.
So, I'm Jewish, so this was all fascinating for me to learn about. And I talked to theologians like Martin Marty. I had him read a couple of chapters, and I was trying to understand Carter's spiritual journey. It became a big issue in 1976 because he was the first self-described born-again president. And the way he handled that, sometimes, evangelicals voted against him in 1980 because his presidency corresponded to the rise of the religious right, and the moral majority was started when he was president. And there are, first I mentioned, that when he's going through this born again experience, it doesn't happen overnight the way his sister described it. He didn't have like a single, like, come to Jesus moment, in 1967. It was a slower process. He was reading deeply in the works of people like Reinhold Niebuhr, who said, the sad duty of politics is to do justice in a sinful world, which I think sums up Carter's attitude toward politics. And then he volunteers for a few weeks to do missionary work for the Baptist Church in the North. But then he quarrels with. I have the transcript of this meeting when he's governor with these right-wing ministers who are mad at him because he thinks that the drinking age should be lowered to 18, and because if you can fight, reason you should be able to get a beer, and because he made it easier for dry counties to go wet, and they were furious with him, and he was right back up in their face, like he was never going to take any grief from these guys on the religious right. And then, of course, years later, he left. At the turn of the century, he left the Southern Baptist Convention over their treatment of women, the largest Christian Protestant denomination in the United States. And he now works with Reformed Baptists, liberal Baptists. And he said that he would pray as many as 30 times a day for strength to do his best. Mm. One of the reasons it's called his very best. That's what he would pray for often. And then say prayers with Rosalynn before bed in Spanish. First president to deliver a speech in Spanish. And when I've asked people what drives him, why, what he's done after the presidency, when most of the rest of them go off and give corporate speeches and play golf and go on boards, and so he traveled to over 100 countries, got involved in not just disease eradication, but so many other things in terms of revolutionizing agriculture in Africa. The list goes on. I asked what drives him, and people kept coming back to his faith. And in some ways, I think he's more of a Methodist, which was what Rosalynn's original faith is. They now go to a Baptist church in Plains, Georgia, that was started because the Plains Baptist Church discriminated against blacks. So after he became president, his friends started this new church, and until very recently, you could see him mowing the grass there, and Rosalynn's vacuuming in the sanctuary. And I went to his Sunday school lessons, which he's not, unfortunately, since last year, he hasn't been able to do. But they were these wonderful for people who come from all over the world, and it didn't matter what faith you were. There was such wisdom in these Sunday school classes. But I think that when I mentioned the Methodism, he has a lot in common with John Wesley, really the founder of Methodism, and Wesley believed that we should do as much as we can for as many as we can for as long as we can, and I think that spirit animates Jimmy Carter.
Amazing. And I think one of the other questions wants to describe him as a humanitarian, but not a humanist, which I think is right, because humanitarian is someone who has, care for the values and vision that you were just describing in terms of this Wesleyan approach to one's role in life while alive. Whereas humanist tends to be an a-religious person, at least those are not mutually exclusive, but
right.
That's my characterization of this question. So
right. When right wing, I can't remember which one it was, but these evangelical leaders came and saw him in the White House, and they started berating him. You're a secular humanist, and like he hadn't even heard that expression before, and that was the beginning of a lot of this crap. And he, just to tell one story that I think explains a lot about Jimmy Carter. So I think people are familiar with the Playboy interview, which was in the fall of 1976. And he said it was not a smart thing for him to say. He said, I've lusted in my heart, right? And people thought it was a little weird. And then he talked about, he didn't blame people for shacking up. He was trying to tell the Playboy audience that he wasn't a prude, right? And that he wasn't judgmental, but he went a little overboard. And he had this problem of TMI often. Like he talked about Montezuma's revenge. He talked about his hemorrhoids at one point because he thought the president needed to be candid, and that he couldn't not go to work without explanation. And anyway, he says this thing about lust in my heart. He drops 10 points in the polls. And one of the reasons he drops is all these ministers, these evangelicals, say, oh, tisk, tisk, tisk. He said, I lust in my heart. And this made Carter and his sons furious. One of his sons, Jeff, he has 3 sons and Amy. Jeff went on the radio and denounced Billy Graham at that point because they all knew that when they were like 10, 11 years old as young Baptists, they were taught that every young man lusts in his heart. And it's okay to admit that. And it is as much of a sin as actually doing something wrong, right? And, in their tradition, right? So for these guys who knew that they had been told this when they were 11 years old, to jump on Carter just really pissed them off. So then fast forward a year, Carter's president, and his sister, Ruth, the evangelist, says Oral Roberts, who started Oral Roberts University in Oklahoma, big institution, evangelical Christian institution. He would be honored if the president came and delivered the convocation address. And what President Carter told his sister was, and this tells you a lot about Carter, he says, oh, tell Oral, I'm so honored to have been asked to deliver such an important address. But of course, I cannot agree to do so because I have lusted in my heart. Which was like a big F you,
Wow.
And that, Carter could be.
That's not a weak statement.
Carter and he, when he was governor, he had this severe critic who was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. His name was Reg Murphy, and he was kidnapped and held hostage. And when they came when word spread that he'd been kidnapped, Carter's first reaction to his staff was, it wasn't me, I didn't do it, right? And then he was kidnapped by a guy named Williams, and Williams was caught. He was released. The hostage, Reg Murphy, was released after a couple of days, and Williams was sent to prison. And, a few years later, Chip Carter, one of Carter's sons, says to his father, hey, right after Carter's elected, he hasn't been sworn in. Hey, Dad, what's the first thing you're going to do when you're sworn in? And he said, pardon, Williams. So he had this tough part of him, sometimes a little really barbed sense of humor that people don't associate with Jimmy Carter. In fact, they don't associate any sense of humor with him because in public, he really didn't do that. And he was such an inferior communicator to compare.
Did that show up in your interviews with him?
No, I wouldn't say that it did, but I mean, when I brought up the Williams story, he smiled and he loved that I was going to put that in. And then there's another one that is harder to tell, but he gets this memo from somebody in the Justice Department when he's president, and he's talking about the Attorney General, and he spells general Genetal instead of Genaral. So Carter writes in the margins, it's genital. So he did, he had this kind of mordant sense of humor. It's not huge. He's not our funniest president. And a lot of times he would tell jokes that would fall flat at various times. But there is this person beneath our image of him. And on another thing, I just forgot to mention, I mentioned Reagan. So like Reagan, basically, I think he won as much because of double-digit inflation and interest rates as he did because of the Iran hostage problem or the Kennedy challenge, maybe more. That might have been the single biggest factor. And it was Carter, not Reagan, who appointed Paul Volcker, who I interviewed shortly before he died, as chairman of the Federal Reserve. And Volcker jacked up interest rates right before the 1980 election, basically dooming Carter. And then his harsh medicine ended inflation in this country, so that by the time Reagan was ready to run for re-election, it was morning in America. So, Volcker basically elected Reagan twice. We know the president doesn't have that much to do with the economy. And so Volcker on a fishing trip asked Carter, he apologized to Carter, "I'm sorry if I cost you the election." And Carter very genially responded, "Don't worry about it. There were a lot of factors." But same way, the weapons that helped win the Cold War were built in the Carter administration, like the B-2 bomber. So there are a lot of misconceptions about the difference between Carter and Reagan.
Now, we don't have time to get into it, but that was actually going to be one of my questions, which was a lot of the successes, at least in the early years of the Reagan presidency, really were reaping the benefits of things that had been sowed during Carter's time. That's often true of many presidential transitions, but it seems particularly interesting as one narrative to understand that period of time here. I promised people we would talk about lessons for the presidency and presidential leadership and what makes for a good president. So I'm going to leave that open to you to talk about. Well, what do we learn about the presidency, and what is the advice we get from your analysis of Jimmy Carter that can shape the next president that takes office in January?
Well, Woodrow Wilson said, and he had his shortcomings, especially on race, but he said the presidency is preeminently a place of moral leadership. And we've certainly gotten away from that in the last 4 years. So I think Carter can light our way back to integrity, honesty, and accountability in the presidency. And I think Biden is very well positioned to restore all three. Carter sometimes took accountability to a fault. Dan Rather interviewed him on the eve of the 1980 convention and asked him to grade himself, and he gave himself some B minuses and C pluses, and Trump, of course, just A plus for everything. And so Carter was sometimes too open about things, but the general idea of being open and transparent and honest, what could be more important? And then they also, at the end of the administration, Mondale toasted Carter, and he said, "We told the truth, we kept the peace, and we obeyed the law." And at the time, that seemed like kind of minimum requirements, but with coming out of a presidency with what is it, number is up over 10,000 lies. He didn't get us into a war, but we have well over 200,000 Americans, and tens of thousands of them needlessly lost their lives because of his horrific mismanagement of the pandemic. And then in terms of obeying the law, he did not. Donald Trump did not. So, these sort of basic qualities, they're important. Where Biden has it over Carter is he doesn't need any instruction from Carter on dealing with Congress. Because this Carter, even though he got a lot of bills through, a lot more than people remember, he could have done even more, say with Ted Kennedy, if he had managed that relationship better. And Joe Biden will do that. I mean, there's some questions as to whether he might compromise too soon, as some people thought he did in the Obama administration. But I would caution progressives to understand that, when you're making the sausage, one of the lessons that you should learn from a Jimmy Carter, who had trouble compromising as well, is don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And this, Obama said this a lot. Carter said this. Presidents have gotten a lot through, like Lyndon Johnson said this. They knew this. And so it's going to be very important, especially if Mitch McConnell is running the Senate, that one of the lessons be, don't blow the whole thing up just because you can't get everything that you want.
I'm going to ask two more questions to take us into wrap up. One from the audience. What, if anything, surprised you most about President Carter or his wife while writing this book?
I would say in personal terms, it was just the human scale of the life they live in Plains, Georgia. Going to Plains, it's much more foreign than a foreign country for Americans. I mean, it is for somebody from Boston. I really recommend it as an experience to drive out into rural Georgia, even if you don't go to Plains itself. And so, we would have dinner down there. My wife came with me at one point, with them on, paper plates, just at a neighbor's house. And you have to kind of pinch yourself to realize, this guy was president. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And he's, at one point he's giving the interns a tour of his boyhood home, and as I mentioned, until pretty recently, cutting the grass at the church. And so he's not, when he walks into a room, and I had met him before when I was at Newsweek, I'd met him, and I'd actually worked as an intern in his White House in 1978, although I didn't, I just shook his hand that summer. That was the first time I ever met him. But he's not imposing. He's not one of these larger than life characters, and he's not humble. Nobody in politics is truly humble, but he has a humility and a Zen-like quality to him in person. And politically, in terms of his record, I was surprised by things throughout my research, just things that he had accomplished or skills that he had that I had no idea of before. And in some cases, like him running through a melted down nuclear reactor in 1952, which were not there in the record either, that I'm excavating, and I'm deep into sort of Canadian reports from Canadian nuclear commissions and that kind of thing. I'm not sure they have those at the Boston Public Library, but I found some of them online, and so it was really fun for me, as I think it is for any historian, to come upon things in the letters, like his correspondence with Muhammad Ali. Just every day there would be surprises in the papers, and that was fun for me throughout.
Well, I know this will be available online later, but we're doing this live the day before Veterans Day in the U.S. And Jonathan, I see an emblem behind you over your right shoulder. Would you mind telling us what that is?
Yeah, so that is a recruitment poster for aviators in World War II. And my late father, who was born 2 years before Jimmy Carter, he, was of that generation. In Carter's case, he was at the Naval Academy. He thought he was going to be in World War II. If it had gone on any longer, he would have been. And my father saw that poster and later, I think, bought it online. And he went down to a recruitment station in Chicago in 1942 and enlisted after Pearl Harbor and flew 31 combat missions over Nazi Germany in World War II and was shot down at one point. And so, it honors my father, who, like, along with my late mother, I think about often. Just in terms of that generation, which was called by Tom Brokaw the greatest generation, they had a different set of life experiences, not all positive.
Mm.
The way Carter had difficult relations with his sons, in part because he came out of that generation where they saw fatherhood in a way that's different than say my baby boomer generation does, and he learned a lot. And we actually had really interesting conversations about that, because when his sons were little, he took a paddle that his mother had been a fraternity mother at Auburn University. She had the fraternity paddle, and he would hit them with it. And now he's like not happy that he did that, not happy about a number of things that he did when his sons were young, and the way he had trouble negotiating that. So that the reason I mention that is that this greatest generation, their service, his commitment to serving others that comes out of this generation, and his astonishing multiple competencies, which reminds me of my own father, which I think is something that our generation has lost. Beyond jack of all trades to Renaissance man in Carter's case, and a broad education that is similar to my father's education that he got from Plains High School. He was the only president ever to mention his high school teacher in an inaugural address. And she introduced him to amazing, she made him read War and Peace and many other things. And then at Georgia Southwestern State University, Georgia Tech, and the Naval Academy, again, getting this broad education. And so, I feel like sometimes my generation and following generations, in comparison, I do feel a sense of inferiority to my father and Carter's generation. I think they acquitted themselves better than we have, certainly in the boomer generation. They are a much more accomplished generation than the baby boomers. So I think of that when I think of my father and of Jimmy Carter.
Well, what a great note to end on. Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing this work with us and your personal thoughts and reflections. And, I think this is a very personable read. And so I encourage everybody to get the book or borrow the book. So thank you for joining us. And I just have a couple of notes about upcoming programs. Good luck with the book.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. And so thanks everybody for joining us tonight. This, as with most of our programs, will be available online a little bit later on. Just 2 slides to let you know about some upcoming talks from the library. This Thursday, in our Baxter Lecture Series, we will have Nathaniel Philbrick doing a book review and topic review on the Mayflower, which certainly is his 2006 book. And we'll be uncovering a little bit of the language used in that work to understand there are multiple perspectives when it comes to the arrival of Europeans on this continent. Thursday, November 19th, we have in partnership with the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, a poetry reading, Poetry for Black Lives, a reading and conversation, including with my good friend and former poet laureate of the city of Boston, Daniel Legros-Georges. And then in this series, the Arc of History Contested Perspective series, we'll be wrapping up the series with 2 talks in December. Adam Davidson, better known from radio, who we will be turning our eye on to the economy in society, the new rules for thriving in the 21st century. And on December 9th, Neil Gabler with Catching the Wind, the new book on Edward Kennedy and the Liberal Hour. We'll perhaps revisit the question of the Kennedy-Carter relationship in the context of that talk. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you once again to Jonathan Alter. Thank you to our production staff here at the BPL. Please be well, please be safe. See you next time.